I started clipping these newspaper, magazine article stories about Christian athletes. I didn't know who was Christian, and they didn't know who was Christian amongst each other. These clippings were key elements in the unfolding of the story. The next question was then, how do we bring them together? And there was no money in those days. There was no name. There was no conscious awareness of how we would do this thing. I tried for months to get to Mr. Ricky and kept getting discouraged by his male secretary, Ken Blackburn, in Pittsburgh at Forbes Field, where he was at this time. And so finally, after 6 or 8 months of badgering by calls and so on, we were going through Pittsburgh, and so I called the day before and said, "Is Mr. Ricky going to be in tomorrow?" Ken said, "Yes, as far as I know, but I can't promise you again, as I've always been saying, you can't dictate what his schedule is going to be." So I said, "Well, I'll be at Forbes Field at 8 o'clock if that's okay." By this time, he knew who Don McClanen was. And so we drove into town the night before, and Gloria and the kids were in a motel, and I went over to Forbes Field and was sitting in the outer office as it opened at 8 o'clock or whatever it was, whatever time it was. And in walked Mr. Ricky, and through the office, and within about less than 15 minutes, Ken Blackburn came out and said, "Mr. Ricky will see you now for that 5 minutes you want with him." So I walked in and walked out 5 hours later, and I feel FCA was born in a new way at that time. It was a provenience of God, obviously, in this man who grilled me in a wonderfully loving, direct way, wanting to know who I was and where my faith was, and it was very immature and very modest, I would say, at that point, but I did know enough to tell him that I believed in Jesus and that this was a movement that would be to honor God, and that God was calling it into being. And I said that's one of the reasons I persisted on being with you, as I've been trying to for several months now. And he said, he really grilled me on the Christocentric, so that this was not something that was promoting myself or promoting a group of athletes for the sake of athletics, but rather for the kingdom, of God, for Christ. And so he said, "How did you get here? Are you independently wealthy?" And I said, "No, very modest, with 2 young kids just starting a career in coaching." And I said, the truth of the matter is we mortgaged our car to get here. Mr. Ricky's willingness in that meeting to say, I asked him if he would be willing to host a meeting in Pittsburgh of these men to try to get some funding help. What was happening, I see now, was God was bringing individual Christian athletes together and deepening them, as will always happen in community. Community is so essential, and therefore today, like the huddle groups and the gatherings of parents and teachers, and coaches and teachers, and on college campuses and in homes and places like that, the church is coming alive in continuing way, not just through the sanctuary where they worship on Sunday, but in the homes and in the locker rooms and in places like that. Hero worship was a part of the phenomenon of it, and still is. And that was a key kernel in this thing, which I don't know that I realized. When Peter Marshall's book came out saying, from one of his sermons, 17 million youth in America were unchurched, that shocked me. Because I grew up in the church. I thought everybody was a Christian. But there's 17 million, Peter Marshall was saying, who don't even go to church, much less have Christ as a guide or as a partner. The question is often asked, is FCA as needed or as relevant today as it was back there? And I would say more so. FCA is God's amazing, miraculous dream being fulfilled still to this day. And the question is, can we continue, can FCA continue to be Christ-centered and see that cross and not get lost up in the instruments of the sport world that may go whatever way and lead people in whatever direction, pro or con, positive or negative, which is the world of reality. Sin is real. The life of Christ is real.